What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to a special episode of Mortal Realms Monday. This episode will be accompanying the painting the Knight of Azir. As this is episode 7, which should fall in line with issue 7, issue 7 didn't come with any miniatures, so I've decided to show you an alternate paint scheme for the Sequitors. Now, the base that came with one of my Sequitors from issue 9 is a standard flat base, nothing special about it, and I want it to match my other Stormcast. So what we're going to do is make a base to basically match. We're going to use a mixture of foam core and green putty. And there you go, we can see the finished result of one that I did earlier in true Blue Peter fashion. So we've got green putty to make the paving stone there, and then some foam core for the step. I would like to apologise for the voiceover audio on this. I did record it all as I was going, and realised that the microphone was turned off and didn't record any of the audio. And obviously it's not easy to go back and remake or repaint a miniature as you go. Now you can see here the foam core that I use, the paper peels off, but not as good as some of the cheaper foam core. So if your paper peels off easily, then it's a good idea to peel the paper off. If not, you can take a craft knife and just carefully slice just under the paper, removing that. So first of all, we want to get a layout for our base. So we're just going to trace around one of the bases. Now obviously the base of the base is going to be wider than the top of the base, as they do have a slight beveled edge. But this is just to get a rough idea of what we want our foam core steps or stone pieces to be. So I'm going to be doing something similar to this miniature here, with the flat stone there, and then just a couple of stone pieces on the back of the model, and then we'll put some sand and stuff around the edge. So you can see the pencil line there, and just tear that off. So what we're going to do is with pencil, but what I will end up doing is switching to a pen here to show you, but we will mark out an area that we want of our base to be stone. So for example, to replicate the one that I've got there, I drew in the steps. Here you go, you can see me marking it with pen so that you guys can see what I'm doing. So I'm just marking where the grooves of the stones would be. I'm trying to keep it as random as possible. Obviously with the edge step there, that's a straight line, and then a mixture of small, large, long, short stones. I'm just marking the general pattern that I want. So next up, you take your craft knife, and I find that going with an up-down motion, sort of like sawing, is easier to do around rather than trying to slice around. And the idea is that you're pushing deep to hit your cutting board there, and just up and down, letting the knife do the work whilst following around the circle. Obviously I'm only going halfway around here, as I'll be slicing along the bottom line there. But once you've done that, it's not going to come out, so you're going to have to then slice. But because we've essentially taken off most of the foam core, it's easier to get the knife round in a smoother fashion, without sort of slipping all over the place and cutting into areas we don't want. And then obviously with a straight, you can push straight down and just slice through. So a couple of slices gets us through the paper on the back end, and then we can go ahead and pop that out. Now that there is where I would be for the if I was using it as the other base there. So next up, we take the craft knife and just score about a third of the way in. We don't want to go too deep. You're not slicing these up, you're just making an indentation, but we're going to score all along our marked out lines. Obviously be careful when doing this. You are working with a sharp craft knife, and you don't want to go cutting yourself. Just make sure you're slicing away from your fingers. Next, I'm going to take the craft knife. Obviously, if you have cheaper glue on your foam core, you should be able to just peel this off. I had a bit of trouble with mine, so I just carefully slice. I'm not putting any pressure, I'm just using a backwards and forwards motion just to peel underneath. Obviously being very careful and aware of my fingers at all times. I mean, if you want to leave the paper on with this, that is fine. I just find that when it comes to the next step, the paper tends to give a bit of a weird effect between the stones. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. There we go. Now if you find that you've cut a little uneven, don't worry, it just gives more life to the stone. You know, no stones are perfectly even, you do get some ups and downs in them, so I find that doing this does just give it a little bit more realism. So once all the paper's off, we want to take a mechanical pencil, and with none of the lead protruding, so the pencil I've got here is a Paper Mate, and it uses the end to adjust the lead. If you've got one where you click the top, then just hold it down and push the lead back in so that there is no lead pointing out. And all we're going to do is just gently score down those lines that we made with the knife, and what this will do is widen them up slightly and give us some nice grooves for between each of the stones. Okay, so next up we're going to take some green stuff modelling putty. If you've got any other type of modelling putty, that is fine. I'm using the last of what I have in this piece here, but I find if you can get about half a base's worth, then mix it together. That is generally enough to cover 2/3 of a base. If you want to do an entire base, then aim for around 2/3 of the base worth of putty, and that should give you enough to cover the entire base. But it all depends on how much of the base you want to cover. Obviously you don't need to cover where the your stonework is going, unless you want the single stones over the top of the stonework that you'll be laying down. Then obviously you want to cover the base entirely. But I do recommend leaving the rim of the base, or some of the rim, for some sand and dirt, so that you can just blend that out to an edge. So you can see here I'm just rolling this out into a sort of sausage type shape, and then what we're going to do is apply this to the center of the base. I do go a little short here. Now it's important that the base is dry so that this sticks well. The fact that the base is textured, I did have a little bit of yellow half in there that had gone solid. Didn't notice that, but that's not too bad. Right, so next off you want to take a round object. I'm using a sculpting tool here, but any kind of paintbrush handle or anything that's round will do. Dip it in some water, which is just off camera here, and what that will do is stop your modelling clay and putty from sticking to the handle as you roll it. And then you want to just roll out, applying pressure, and just stretch the putty across the base here. It does take a bit of time, bit of pressure. This is where it's important that you get it a little bit more towards the center. Makes it easier to roll backwards and forwards then, rather than just in one direction. So you can see here my roller does start to dry off, and you'll see that it will pull up the putty, which is why it's important to make sure that you do keep this wet. And obviously you don't want the base wet because the putty won't stick to the base. So you can see it's going to start to pull up there and here, there you go, you can see it's now stuck to the handle, and this is the problem you get. So obviously just apply that back down, wet the handle again, and roll it flat. You can also wet the tip of your finger and just smooth over the putty, and that way you won't get any fingerprints into the putty. Make sure anything that you're applying to that putty that you don't want it sticking to is wet. Obviously the putty's wet here, so I can just smooth it over. Got that a little bit of hard yellow there, but as you'll see at the end, that does actually give quite a nice effect to it, so didn't turn out too bad. But I do recommend making sure you don't have any hard pieces of your putty when you're mixing the two together. So we'll jump now to the next step, and I'll catch you guys in a second. Okay, so once that's all smooth, take a mechanical pencil, and this time you do want the lead pointing out. I did find that it helps to dip this in a little bit of water as well, but essentially you want to start scoring out the stonework. So this will obviously be the grooves between the stones. Any putty that ends up on your pencil, just remove. And you'll notice here that as you drag the pencil, you'll get some raised edges. Just wet your finger slightly and then just smooth over, and that will blend it back down, and then you can re-groove or rescore the groove and just work through. And there you go, you can see that it levels off nice. So make sure that you give your stones rounded corners. It does tend to look better. And if you come to an area that's going to be a cross section between the grooves, or a T-section or something, then just make sure that you round in all directions like so. And if you're coming down this way, then obviously make sure that all corners are rounded. And again, wet finger, just smooth it over to flatten those edges. Okay, once that's done, we should have something that looks like this. So I'm just finishing smoothing it off here. You can push away the edge of the base slightly, just so we can get some areas for the sand to apply. You can see the area of base there that I've left, which I'm going to have some sand and the stone pieces that I've cut out. So there you go. Obviously make sure that the edges of your putty smooth down at a slight bevel just towards the edges of the base. It will give it a nicer look. So I'm just making sure that all my stones are rounded on the corners. Like I say, it gives a better effect. If you don't want that effect, then there's no need for that, but I do recommend smoothing over everything just to make sure that it is it's fine. So now what I'm going to do is take the piece that I made earlier, because I don't want it looking the same as the previous one I'd made. I'm just going to cut a couple of sections out and use this as broken up paving or walls, or anything like that, just some rubble basically. I'm just going to rough up some of the edges here. The beauty of these bases is every one of them can be unique, but you can get them matching closely, or at least sort of uniform. And you can also make molds from them with some resin and silicone. So you can make some silicone molds up and pour your resin in to make multiples of the bases. So if you make 5 or 6 of these, make up your molds. I'm just trying to find where I want pieces. Now I've decided that this piece is a little bit too high and I want it half depth, so I'm just slicing a small piece off, and that will give me some variation in height on the stone there. So there you go, that's where I've decided they'll be. Obviously I will glue those down. If they in the putty will actually set and act as a glue anyway, so if you push them a little bit, then you can essentially leave them there in the putty, and that will hold them there. but otherwise just some PVA glue on the back. Obviously don't use super glue with this, it will melt the foam. So what we're going to do next is apply some PVA glue around the base and over the top of the foam, so that when we come to spray painting it, it won't melt the foam. You do want a good 4 or 5 coats of PVA over these foam sections, just to make sure that there is a good barrier between the foam and the spray paint, otherwise the spray paint will melt the foam. Otherwise you can base paint with any kind of acrylic and just apply it by hand. So let's jump to the next section. Once this is dried, it does take about an hour for this modelling putty to dry, so leave it plenty of time. So here we go. Next on, we're going to take some regular PVA. This has had time to pretty much fully set now. It is a little bit tacky, but it is pretty much there. So just some regular PVA craft glue. You can buy this at any hobby store. And what we're going to do is just put some on the palette here so that we can thin it down slightly with some water. And then we'll, with an old brush, just apply it over the model. You don't have to go over the green stuff, just get it around the edges where you want the gravel to stick, and then obviously across the top of the foam there. I do recommend doing this a little bit differently to how I filmed it. Put on a few layers over your foam first, don't worry about the gravel section, just make sure that you've got a good 4 or 5 layers over the foam, waiting about 5 minutes between each layer for it to dry, and then apply the next layer. Once you've got that, you can then go and put the glue where you want your gravel to be. If you do it at the same time as I do here, you'll see the problem that I end up with, where the gravel obviously sticks to the glue on top of the stones as well. It's not a huge problem, you can brush it off with a wet brush and remove some of that gravel, but it's obviously easier if you do the foam first. So I'm just applying the glue anywhere that I want the gravel to be, so just a little bit up the sides there, and around the edges. You can put it onto your stonework a little bit, your paving. It just gives it the impression of the, you know, mud and stuff that has been pulled across, and it sort of breaks up the shape a little bit. Obviously I've got to get in that gap there. Just a little bit more over the foam there. You can never have too much glue over that foam. Just obviously make sure that you're not clogging up the scored out sections, the grooves. You don't want the PVA filling that in, otherwise it's not going to take the wash later on. So what I've got here is a homemade mix of sand and gravel. What this actually is bird sand for the finer stuff and bird grit for the stones, in a 3-to-1 mix of sand to stone. I find that any more than that, you end up with too much stone in there and you end up with a really rocky surface. I do have a couple of other pots filled up, one pure sand and one pure stone, so that I can pull a bit of stone out if I want certain clumps in an area. But this was a £1 a bag for a kilo bag from Wilkinson, but you can get it from pretty much any pet store. So all I'm going to do here is just sprinkle on the sand where I want it. You could essentially push the base down into the gravel and then push the sand and that over the top of it, but I just wanted to be a little bit more accurate with how I was placing it here, so I'm just going to place that all over and then give it a shake off and a gentle tap. Now you can see here where I didn't let the glue dry on the top, so I'm now taking a wet brush and just removing the gravel from where I want it. I did find that the gravel that does stick to the top does actually give it a nice effect. You get, you know, a grain or two, and it will give it a nice texture. Obviously no stonework is going to be completely gravel free when it's surrounded by dirt and whatever, mud. You are going to get some of that up on there, so it is nice to leave a little bit on there, but obviously remove what you can from within the grooves. You don't want them filled up, as we are going to apply a wash when painting this. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove any gravel that I don't want with this wet brush, removing it from any of the grooves between the stones, and we'll jump back in just a second. So once the sand has had time to dry, what we're now going to do is thin down some more PVA and apply this again all over the sand and the foam core, just so we've got extra PVA on the foam core. But if you've done 4 or 5 layers, then you should be fine. But we do want to put this thin down PVA over the gravel, and that will give it a protective coat and stop any gravel from coming loose and falling off when we're done. So we're just going to go ahead and apply this all around the base over the gravel, and we'll be back in just a bit. Okay, so now that the PVA had time to dry, I've gone ahead and spray painted over the base there. Obviously you can see here I did have a decent amount of PVA on the foam, so it hasn't melted it. I will show you on the other base that I made just here, I didn't quite have enough PVA on there, and it has melted slightly. Nothing too bad, but it has eaten away at the stone a little bit. Now this doesn't matter too much as long as it hasn't melted huge dips in your foam, but I find that it gives a rough, uneven look to the stone. No stones are cut perfect, so it all depends on the finish that you want. But I do recommend obviously making sure you've got a good coat over there. So now for painting, we're going to take some Mornfang Brown and apply this to all the areas of gravel, so all over the dirt, around the edges. So just slightly thin down, and then I'm just dabbing it in to get it between all the little pieces there. And obviously you can get it a little bit on the stones themselves. It'll just be dry areas of mud and dirt. So if you want to, if you're following along, you want to go ahead and do this, you can do, and we'll be back once this step is done. Okay, now that that's done and I've gone ahead and painted around the rim of the base as well, we'll now take some Agrax Earth Shade. Should get that pot up in just a sec. There you go. So we'll take some Agrax Earth Shade wash, and we're just going to apply this over the entire base, making sure that a lot of it ends up in the grooves and recesses of our stonework. So just a light coating over the mud work, and then over all of the stone, and this will give it a nice brownish earthy tone to it. So obviously you can go straight from the pot with this. Just make sure that your paint is fully dry first, and there you go. You can see that it gets nicely into those recesses and picks up some of those textures and details along the surface of the stonework there. Makes it look a lot more realistic. So what we'll do is go ahead and let all of this dry, and we'll be back in just a bit. Right, so once that's had time to dry, we're now going to take some Zandri dust, and we're just going to dry brush this over all the mud areas. So taking the majority of the paint off of our brush, just gently touch the top of all the gravel there, just to pick it off and give it some highlight. Now you'll notice that I have made a hole in the base here, and this is due to the miniature that I'll be using in the other tutorial. Had a peg in his foot Now I could have cut that off and glued him straight down, that wouldn't have been a problem, but I like the peg as it would give a little bit more stability, and then just gluing his feet down to the base there. So before the putty had time to set, I just lined up the back end of a paintbrush, a thin paintbrush, and pushed that through the hole, and then removed some of the excess that was in the hole, and then just pushed the miniature down to make sure that his peg fitted in there, and then obviously went on and put the gravel and everything else on. So with that dry brush done, we can now let that dry, and then we'll be back in a few seconds. Right, once the Agrax Earthshade has had time to dry, we can now go and take some Oth1 Grey and lightly pick off any of the edges of the stone there. So just around the edges, and like I say, this is pretty much a dry brush, there's barely any paint on here again, and we're just looking to pick off anywhere that light would pick up. If you make sure that you don't go too down into the grooves, you are looking to just pick up the edges. You could give this a dry brush by making sure there's minimal paint on there, and just go over, obviously a bit too much paint there, so just dab it off with my finger and just pick off some of those edges. And you can see just at the top there near the hole is where I had that tough bit of yellow putty, and it's actually left a nice texture on the base, sort of an uneven piece of stone was used. So you know, one of those happy little accidents, as the great Bob Ross would say. So as you can see, just dry brushing over the top here, and once that is dry, the base will be complete. So we'll just skip to that bit. Right, so just affixing the Knight of Azir here, you can see its peg going down, and there we have it, the finished model and base. I'd like to thank you all for joining me. I hope this tutorial was helpful to some. If you did enjoy it, please hit that thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that little bell for notifications of further videos, tutorials and such. And check out my links in the description for Patreon, Discord, Twitch, Twitter and Instagram. Would love to see you following me there, and thank you all for your support, and I shall catch you all next time.